It's day 295. It's also February 25th, 2020. And we're in Fernandina Beach, Florida. And what's a pandemic? You ever wake up in the morning and ask yourself, what am I doing? And more importantly, why? Yeah, me too. Hi, my name's Craig, and this is my story. A story about life out there. For visuals while listening, search Life Out There on your favorite social media platform or use the links in the podcast description. I didn't make it to Fernandina Beach that next morning. There's just so much of St. Mary's to get to and deal with. Like Cumberland Island and that naval submarine base just up the road. Enjoying a February rainstorm and the great no-see-um adventure of 2020. I eventually did get to Fernandina Beach a couple weeks later, but first up, Cumberland Island. Let me start with a quote from the folks over on the YouTube channel, Georgia Outdoors. Quote, "There are few places where you can walk miles and miles of the Atlantic Ocean without seeing a hotel, a condo, or even another person. This is the beauty of Cumberland Island. Waves roll in as they have for centuries, yet, alone at the edge, you feel as if you're the first person to witness this soothing ebb and flow. Cumberland Island has been host to Indians, slaves, soldiers, and millionaires. Today, the National Park Service protects the island and its heritage." Close quote. Cumberland Island is the largest of Georgia's coastal or barrier islands, and it's pretty massive in comparison to Jekyll Island. The island's nearly 18 miles long and over 36,000 acres. It's also home to a variety of wildlife: white-tailed deer, manatees, various species of sea turtles, and even wild horses. And of course, the American alligator. Oh, and yeah, the snake thing. Cumberland is also home to snakes of the venomous variety. Specifically, the cottonmouth. Some people call those water moccasins. So it seems that one should best be careful when traversing those inland lakes and marsh areas. And most definitely can't leave out that the island is home to one of the largest maritime forests remaining in the entire U.S. And what does maritime forest mean, I wondered? And if I got it right, it's a forest typically within half a mile or so of an ocean, in which the canopies of the larger trees of the island protect the lower-lying vegetation on the island from the salt sprays off the water, helping to ensure the overall health and balance of the vegetation, and thus the ecosystem of an entire region. And the plant species here, they tend to be of a more hardy nature, given the harsh environments they're exposed to. Dang, Mother Nature always seems to have things figured out. And going back a bit, here on Cumberland, it would be yet another subculture of the Timucua. Here, the Takatakuru people would be the first to discover and inhabit the island, and archaeological records tell us their arrival dates back 4,000 years. In the early 1500s, Spanish explorers would arrive on the island, naming it San Pedro. They'd go on to establish missions in the area, solidifying their presence in the region for over a century. It wouldn't be until the 1700s when the British would arrive and begin building forts on the island during the colonization of Georgia. And a treaty would be signed in 1763, in which Spain would officially cede the area to Britain. And British reign over the area would end as the U.S. won their independence and the region became part of the brand new United States of America. And as Jekyll Island was picking up the likes of the Rockefellers, over here, it would be the Carnegies. Or, as I've just learned, the Carnegies, if I'm being proper and in tune with the Scottish heritage of the name.
Carnegie.
Andrew Carnegie.
Carnegie.
Andrew Carnegie.
The Carnegies would take a shine to Cumberland Island when, in 1884, they bought most of it, including one existing home, the Dungeness Mansion. They'd go on to renovate and add on to the home, creating themselves a quiet little 59-room winter getaway. And that winter getaway would become the full-time residence of the widowed Lucy Carnegie and her 9 children, until a fire destroyed the mansion in 1959. But Lucy would also build new estates on the island for many of her children, including an estate called Plum Orchard, a 22,000 square foot, starter home type situation, built as a wedding gift for one of her sons. And another fun side note here. Cumberland Island would also be where JFK Jr. would marry Caroline Bissett some 112 years later in 1996. They were married in the First African Baptist Church, a church built by freed slaves in 1893. And the naming of the island? Well, that introduces yet more Native American people to the mix. Cumberland Island was actually named by a young Yamacraw Indian named Tunahui. He suggested the name in honor of Prince William, the Duke of Cumberland, and the son of King George II of Great Britain. So how would it come to be that a young Yamacraw Indian, a tribe I'd not even read of yet, would name the place? And there's a whole other story behind that, for a different time maybe, but for now, in short, it seems the Yamacraw were a small band of Indians to emerge in the late 1700s, originally in the Savannah region. But they disagreed with how other native tribes in the area were interacting with European settlers, so they broke off and went out to explore on their own. And when it came to Cumberland and the British development of it, this young Tunahui would become a critical element in the negotiation process, which would lead to his suggestion for the name. And fast forward to today? Well, first, Cumberland Island would be established as a national park and seashore in the 1960s, placing its ownership within the National Park Service. There are still some private properties on the island, mainly owned by the descendants of folks like the Carnegies. These private properties are leased back to the owners for their lifetime, and eventually they will revert to the National Park Service. It's a really cool place and beautiful. And then there's that naval submarine base at Kingsbay, just up the road from where we're parked. It's a massive 16,000-acre facility established in 1978 and becoming fully operational in 1989. The base serves as the home port for the U.S. Navy's Atlantic Fleet of ballistic missile submarines. It also includes facilities for the Strategic Weapons Facility Atlantic and the Submarine Group 10, which is a critical component of the nation's strategic defense, housing 8 Ohio-class submarines armed with Trident missiles. Those are the nuclear ones. The base is home to over 10,000 personnel. For most any measure I could find, it's the largest facility of its kind in the entire country. And then there was the Great No-See-Um event of 2020. Pretty valuable lesson, learned the hard way. So let me start by saying one of the first things I'd noticed as we settled in here in St. Mary's was how everyone always had their windows closed. Not just closed, but covered. It was always curious to me because I'm more of a windows wide open sort. I always figured, windows? Well, they're there for a reason. Not so much to shut out the outside, but to bring it in. And living here, in particular, why would you not want to look at all this all the time? I also noticed that even if folks had decks and porches, those were covered up too. Not just screened in, but covered up. And here in the RV parks, well, that was different too. I was seeing for the first time these screened-in tent structures outside the RVs, and I never really did figure that one out. I just figured maybe they were going to be here for the summer, getting ready for mosquitoes. I never bothered to ask. Maybe I shoulda. 'Cause for me, like I said, windows wide open. And it was awesome. Until that one morning. You know when you wake up and you're all blurry-eyed? Well, I stretched and I was getting ready to go make some coffee. And as things were coming into focus, I realized that the entire ceiling of the motorhome, well, it was sort of moving. It was covered with bugs. I hopped out of bed for a closer look, and not gonna lie, the pulse rate was climbing a bit as I realized that everywhere I looked, from the screens to the countertops, and yep, the ceiling, was covered with these tiny little bugs. I had just woke up, no coffee. So basically, just reacted. Didn't really have the capacity to think things through at this point. First up, Dougie's collar and leash, Billie's harness, and out the door. With the boys tethered in their usual spots, it was back inside for their food and water dishes. Rinse and dry 'em out, fresh food and water, close all the windows. Back outside. Sat there with the boys for a minute and decided it'd be a quick run into town for some bug bombs. And coffee. An hour or so later, inside the RV, every cabinet door open, and 3 bug bombs had been deployed. And the boys and I sat outside and waited. At least I had coffee. Now, the instructions on the bug bomb said I needed to wait 2 hours or so. And we were just about there when Tom rode up on his bike. "Morning, boss." And I don't think I've written about Tom here yet. He's a young guy, curious sort. Looks to be late 20s maybe. Says he lives up the road with his mom and brother. He rides by on his bike 2 to 3 times a day, at least. And even though he knows my name, he always calls me boss. So today was no different. He said he was headed into town for a job application. The new Dollar General next to the gas station is hiring. I wished him luck and explained my day was going to be spent cleaning up some sort of bug invasion as I looked back at the RV. And before I went any further, Tom said, "You got no-see-ums?" "No-see-ums?" I asked. "Yeah, you know, sand gnats. Some call 'em biting midgets. I call 'em no-see-ums 'cause you can't see 'em till they bite you. They like the same weather we do. These days coming on 80, they'll crawl right through your screens." "Huh, sand gnats," I said again. And a whole bunch of questions had all been answered, all at once. As Tom rode off, I thought, kinda wish the terms sand gnats or no-see-ums or even biting midgets had come up in conversation a little earlier. I guess folks just think you know. And now I know. It was an entire day spent cleaning. Cleaning everything. Every dish, every piece of silverware, every nook and cranny vacuumed, mopped, and wiped down. 2 bags of clothes and towels have been dropped at the laundry for pickup tomorrow. Probably the cleanest old Vacilando's been since we started this adventure. And you know I had to hit the internet and check this sand gnat thing out. And sure enough, everything Tom said, and more. A microscopic little bugger of the flying sort, and they do like to bite. They also love areas rich in moisture. Marshes, swamps, river areas, you know, St. Mary's. Kind of like mosquitoes, I guess, but a lot tinier. And from what I can tell, a lot more of them. And nosing around the internet looking for sand gnats, you're gonna read about a few more pesky cohabitants. Here, chiggers, or some say red bugs, another microscopic insect that has an affinity for attaching itself to us humans and our pets, chewing on us till we're all scratchy. At least those buggers don't fly. But fire ants? Yuck. I suppose like everywhere else, we all deal with bees, hornets, wasps, ticks, spiders, flies. But here, we got a couple more. Biting midgets and red bugs. Dougie and I just learned a valuable lesson. And our walks might look a little different from now on. Stick a little closer to the pavement, maybe. Eventually, an afternoon drive, and I'd make it that 30 miles south of St. Mary's, and find the exit to Amelia Island, the northernmost of Florida's barrier islands, and a member of the barrier island chain known as the Golden Isles. These islands stretch from Florida all the way up to South Carolina, and Fernandina Beach is the largest community on the island. 13,000 or so call the place home, and it's home to several buildings on the National Historic Register, and most of them are still in use today. The town is a popular tourist destination year-round, and I really enjoyed an afternoon of walking through the downtown area, studying the structures, some of them hundreds of years old, and reading about activity dating back deep into the 1700s. Another area first discovered and inhabited by the Timucuans. It seems the French were the next in line, before being run out by the Spanish, who would ultimately cede to the British, just before the Americans started running the show around here. And it would be during my walk around the town that I'd read the term the Isle of Eight Flags. And I'd also read of the Fernandina Pirates Club, a civic and charitable organization based here in Fernandina Beach. The club was established in 1973 and is dedicated to preserving and celebrating the rich pirate history of Amelia Island. Pirate history? Well, I was already way curious. We'd passed through a few coastal areas, and I'd not read of pirates anywhere. Well, here in Fernandina Beach, pirates and their rich history are a thing. A big thing. I'd first learn that the region around Amelia Island is one of the few deepwater ports in the area, and for centuries has provided ships from across the globe, including pirate ships, safe harbor from Mother Nature, and what at times can be the rage of the Atlantic Ocean. Amelia Island is also the only piece of land in the United States that has been governed under 8 flags. Now, I was impressed to learn of the 6 flags that had flown over Texas, but 8? And talk about a fun read. Now, there's for sure a whole lot more detail here, but just the summary of it all was fun enough to read. According to the Pirates Club, and now hang with me here because there's more than a few twists and turns. The first 2 nations to hoist their flags over the island would be France and then Spain. Turns out that Spain had already claimed the region as their own. They just hadn't made it to this particular island yet, and France was unaware of this when they sailed in and began their settlement of the island. Nor were they aware that this would all be put to an end by the Spanish once they discovered the presence of France, just a couple years later. So France, then Spain, that's 2, and over the next 300 years or so, Britain, the country that would name the island Amelia, and become 3rd on the list of flags to fly over it. And then, after a bit of back and forth between Britain and Spain, the island would land back under the Spanish flag, until those folks were overthrown by the first pirates to show up in the area. And there's a ton of talk around here about how the United States was secretly supporting this first band of pirates, essentially using them and their vessels for the military benefit. And they say that because the U.S. flag would be raised over the island just one day after those pirates had ousted the Spanish. But Turns out, Spain wasn't having any of that either. And they'd retake the island, bring down the American flag, and replace it with their own, marking the third time the Spanish flag had flown over the island. And I think maybe this would be around the time Fernandina Beach would be named in honor of King Ferdinand VII of Spain. And then, a short time after the Spanish had completed their first fort on the island, a young and ambitious Scottish soldier of fortune, along with 55 of his closest friends and musketeers, would storm the island, take down that Spanish flag for its last time, and hoist the Green Cross and the second pirate flag over the island. Spanish forces would indeed return with over 300 men in an attempt to take back the island, but this time, that Scottish guy, MacGregor, well, he'd rallied the locals, who it seems were pretty fed up with all the back and forth and all those years under Spanish rule, and Spain would be sent packing this time, for good. And just when MacGregor thought the place was his, yet another rogue pirate would show up, defeat MacGregor's forces, and add the third pirate flag to the island's history. And through it all, those Americans just kept watching. Because in quick succession, first the 3rd Regiment of the Florida Volunteers, a part of the U.S. Confederacy, would take the island with their flag, the Confederate flag. But within a year, the Union Army would show up, and the U.S. flag would take its place as the final flag to ever fly over Amelia Island and Fernandina Beach. History can be pretty cool. And just thinking back through and trying to visualize all the nuttiness of it all, the back and forth, the business of man wanting what another man has, and just taking it. And I just keep learning. Some things never change really, do they? Man wanting what another man has, and just taking it. I think maybe the only thing that changes is how we do it. So here I am again, walking around a town with centuries of history. A town that has evolved into an impressive tourist hub. A town that welcomes millions each year. And it's excited to share with everyone their deep Native American history. Here, it would be the Napoica people. It would be their centuries-old villages that would transition into the settlement years, in which the town would live life as a strategic outpost for first the Spanish, the British, and eventually the Americans. And woven into all those years, the pirates. Ah, good stuff. Great day. And rolling back into St. Mary's that evening, it was all smoky. Fire somewhere. I walked around outside a bit, trying to figure out where all the smoke was coming from. I mean, there were no sirens, no hubbub. Nobody else was outside. Couldn't see anything that looked like a source. But there was definitely that smoky smell in the air. Finished a walk with Dougie. Still not sure where it was coming from. But it had been a long day, and we hit the sack. Next morning, still smoky. And after a walk with Dougie, I hopped in the car to set out if I could find where all the smoke was coming from. And I did not get far. Entrance to the Crooked River State Park, actually, when I found the source. And a bunch of firefighters. But these guys weren't putting out the fire, they were starting it. And that's when I learned about controlled burns, or as some call them, prescribed burns. It's fascinating to watch these guys lighting fires on one side and then carefully snuffing it out on the other. In a quick conversation with one of the Forest Service guys, he said it was a scheduled thing. They come through during the winter months every few years and burn off the undergrowth. It keeps things cleaned up. Healthier vegetation means less prone to accidental wildfires, and easier to get control of if it does happen. I told him I was confused. How can you light the ground on fire, but the trees don't catch on fire? But I guess it made sense once he explained that burning the vegetation on the ground carefully didn't affect the trees. Keep the fire close to the ground and away from the tree's vegetation. And the reality is, he told me, a mature tree can live through multiple small fires. It's the big fires that take out entire forests and old growth, usually because the surrounding vegetation is years old, providing the perfect fuel. And when I asked, "You were at it all night?" "Yup, best time actually," he said. We watch the weather and the wind patterns closely, and when conditions are right, nighttime burns are actually the best. They're easier to manage because they're easier to see. And I thanked him and got out of his way. It was nice of him to even take a minute. I mean, after all, he was setting a state park on fire. We wouldn't want that to go wrong. But as soon as I got back to camp, I had to dig around a bit about this. I mean, on the West Coast, all I've heard year after year is wildfires, and bad ones. Seems like every year they get worse. I hadn't heard so much about wildfires on the East Coast. And over here, they're literally setting state parks on fire, on purpose. But I mean, carefully and strategically, obviously. And yup, another fascinating topic. Turns out prescribed burns are a thing everywhere. Which maybe I knew, but just had never seen. Georgia will do over 58,000 of them this year alone. And California will do somewhere in the vicinity of 40,000. And maybe I've heard more about wildfire activity on the West Coast because I lived on the West Coast. Wildfires, they happen here too. But there are differences, and far less loss on this side of the country. Climate and more humid weather being a big part of it. Maybe I'll come back around to this in more detail another time. Some fascinating stuff out there, but I just did not have the mental bandwidth at the moment to dig any deeper. I shut the laptop and stepped outside with a beer, just in time for Jim to roll up. I was about to go back inside and grab him a beer when he dangled a six-pack out of the window and blurted, "Got you covered." As he dropped the tailgate of his pickup and grabbed a seat, we chatted a bit, talked about what I had just learned about this controlled burn thing. He said, yeah, they do that quite a bit around here. Any bad wildfires around here, I asked. None that I can remember. I think all that stuff happens up north and more western part of the state. And then Jim asked what I thought about all this virus stuff. Virus? I asked. Yeah, been hearing of it here and there. President says it's a hoax. I think it's a bunch of hooey. Sounds like a dang flu to me, and we get those every year. I told him I hadn't heard a thing, but that I hadn't really been watching the news much. I'll have to have a look. Jim rolled out a few minutes later, and I went straight back to the laptop, turned on the television. We were getting the news channel out of Jacksonville here, and if they had mentioned it, I'd missed it. But online, it looks like on January 23rd, like a month ago.
Viral pneumonia has hit central China's Wuhan city. Authorities have reported 27 cases in total.
It's a new type of coronavirus.
And on January 28th,
the State Department is advising Americans to reconsider traveling to China and just not to go at all to that province where this outbreak began. The State Department is also ordering its consulate workers in Wuhan province, or Wuhan, excuse me.
But then, I came across an article published on February 11th by the BBC. And the title of the article? China and the virus that threatens everything. I thought. A global news organization just told me of a virus that threatens everything. What did that even mean? Well, from the article, let me quote. On a cold Beijing morning, on an uninspiring urban stretch of the Tonghui River, a lone figure could be seen writing giant Chinese characters in the snow. The message taking shape on the sloping concrete embankment was to a dead doctor. Goodbye, Li Wenliang, it read, with the author using their own body to make the imprint of that final exclamation mark. 5 weeks earlier, Dr. Li had been punished by the police for trying to warn colleagues about the dangers of a strange new virus infecting patients in his hospital in the Chinese city of Wuhan. Now he had succumbed to the illness himself, and pictures of that frozen tribute spread fast on the Chinese internet, capturing in physical form a deep moment of national shock and anger. There's still a great deal we don't know about COVID-19. To give the disease caused by the virus its official name, before it took its final fatal leap across the species barrier to infect its first human, it's likely to have been lurking inside the biochemistry of an as yet unidentified animal. That animal probably infected after the virus made an earlier zoological jump from a bat, and it is thought to have been kept in a Wuhan market where wildlife was traded illegally. And beyond that, the scientists trying to map its deadly trajectory from origin to epidemic can say little more with any certainty. Close quote. I'll put a link to the article in the show notes. It goes on to map out a detailed timeline between the first documented case in late November of last year to February 11th of this year. The country seems to be in full-on panic mode, even having somehow managed to build a 2,600-bed hospital within days, placing over 10,000 others in quarantine in stadiums, essentially locking Wuhan down. Dang, I really don't like this. A lot. I take a couple of weeks break from the news, only to learn that some virus born in a place called Wuhan, China, has been potentially unleashed on the world? And for a second I thought, dang, Spanish plague, that cost us like 700,000 lives back in the 20s. And that was just us. Globally, I think some 20 million people died, maybe more. 'Cause, record keeping back in the 20s and all. But then within minutes, I'd stopped reading about the folks that had died across the planet's history as the result of pandemics and realized, hey, I'm in Georgia, St. Mary's. There's some pretty cool stuff and a lot more to see. So I'll just keep an eye and an ear on things and see what happens. Tomorrow's a new day, and I'm not sure where I'll head. But I wonder what I'll learn there.
Turns out, this thing called life comes with a lot of rules. Maybe it's time to break a few.
Because you can.
No, seriously,
You can.